Hi, I'm Baha Jabarin, content creator, product designer, and thought leader at the intersection of quantum computing, AI, and financial services. From my work with financial services and Mimico Design House to building educational content on YouTube, LinkedIn, and podcasts, I'm passionate about making complex emerging tech accessible for tech leaders and decision makers. I'm thrilled about this episode of the Quantum Mindset today. We dive deep with Brian Peretti, former Treasury CTO and author of their landmark AI cybersecurity report on real-world AI risks in finance, fraud data gaps, vendor governance, talent disruption, and quantum threats like harvest now, decrypt later. Whether you're in risk or fintech, this one's packed with actionable insights you won't find in headlines. Let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of the Quantum Mindset podcast. And in this episode, we will unpack how emerging technologies like AI and quantum computing are transforming financial services, risk management, and the future of global finance. So in today's episode, we're deep diving into the practical realities of AI in cybersecurity and fraud prevention, drawing directly from one of the most authoritative reports on the topic. We'll explore current use cases, evolving threats, governance challenges, talent implications, and where quantum computing fits into the risk picture for banks and fintechs. And today it is absolutely my pleasure and honor to have Brian Peretti as my guest. Brian is a key author of the U.S. Department of Treasury's March 2024 report. The report was titled Managing Artificial Intelligence Specific Cybersecurity Risks in the Financial Services Sector. It's a landmark report born from Executive Order 14110 and 42 in-depth interviews with financial institutions, tech providers, and regulators. And it maps how AI is reshaping cyber defense and fraud detection, while also highlighting best practices for risk management, data sharing gaps, and third-party oversight. Brian brings over 2 decades of leadership at Treasury, where he most recently served as Chief Technology Officer, Deputy Chief AI Officer, Executive Officer of Treasury's AI Governance Board, all roles in which he oversaw the report's publication and shaped policies for AI, machine learning, biometrics, and quantum computing. Brian is a career senior executive service member. He directed domestic and international cybersecurity policy, led the Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection, and represented the U.S. as a cybersecurity subject matter expert to the G7 Cyber Expert Group. Now retired from federal service after 23 years, Brian recently joined Billington Cybersecurity's advisory board and has authored books on financial compliance, making him uniquely positioned to bridge policy, practice, and emerging tech in finance. So Brian, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you. So yeah, at this podcast, whether you're a CISO, risk officer, a tech leader in finance, this discussion is promising to deliver grounded insights for navigating AI's promise and perils. So again, Brian, great to have you. Just to kick things off, could you briefly describe the origin story for this report and what the Treasury hoped to achieve by focusing specifically on AI-related cybersecurity and fraud risks in financial services?
First, thank you very much for having me here. Very excited to be here. This is, I think this area is just incredible in the emerging technology space. Things are going to be much different 5 years from now than what it is today. And I think that's the exciting part, right? We're still trying to figure all that out. Really, the origin of the report itself was to go back a couple years before that, was that Treasury had looked at the issue of cloud computing in the financial sector. And while cloud had already been adopted by a lot of firms, what we did was create a report to talk about that, to really identify what was going on in the space of cloud, and then being able to figure out exactly what was going on in that space. We produced a report on that, doing the same type of interviews with folks to understand what was going on, and then being able to push out that information. That was very successful, I think, in setting a level playing field of what was going on in cloud. From that, we then saw artificial intelligence was an area of interest. Cloud had already been adopted. Artificial intelligence was really kind of not just starting, but starting to get the popular imagination out there. People are starting to talk about it outside of the space within the financial sector. And so we said this will be a good area to talk about next to be able to start to set a level set document of what was going on to understand that. Based upon the success we had with the cloud document, it became very easy for us to be able to have conversations with the financial sector, again, tied to AI. One of the things we did that was, I think, really helpful in those conversations was in the first report, we never mentioned who was telling us the information. And that allowed a level of anonymity to be able to go through the document so that people could talk about what they were doing without afraid of being targeted by somebody or needing to um, cover their language in ways which would obstruct who they were. And so that kind of easy conversation really led to a better place than we were as we were talking about the AI situation. So as you mentioned, we interviewed something like 42 different financial firms. One of the key findings of that was that of those 42 firms, we got about 39 different definitions of what artificial intelligence was, which we thought that meant we were in the right space because it wasn't a clearly defined term and firms were looking at it from different angles for different purposes. We also found that AI is something that has been used in the financial sector for several decades. Some people used to call it predictive analytics and other nomenclatures they use, but this wasn't something really new that was being used. The generative AI portion, maybe, but a lot of this stuff had already been done or at least thought about in the financial sector. But we did see there was some hesitation with firms of deploying new and different technologies within their space. They value the trust between financial institution and customer, and they didn't want to have something that would put out wrong information or perhaps could damage that relationship. So being able to make sure that they had a tight relationship between themselves and their customers became critical. And as they rolled this out, they wanted to make sure that that trust was still there and that the information and the decisions were being made by a human on their side as opposed to some machine kicking something out because they felt that that would be really damaging to the integrity of the relationship. So another key thing we found from that report was that um, the financial firms we talked to, none of them said AI introduces new risk. All they said was that the AI changes the risk posture that they had, and they have to think about it in slightly different ways. But the model risk is model risk, which financial firms have been dealing with for many decades, right? Because they always know models aren't always accurate and they have to adjust for that. So, but now they have to look at it differently. Attacks against them using AI are probably going to be very similar to the current attacks that are going on, right? A spear phishing email that's better written, some voice identification issue that was just more closely to the person. These are all things financial firms have been working on and tackling for a while now. And all they know is that they have to continue to add more layers because bad actors do bad things. And so, thinking within their current risk framework, this fit nicely within that construct. And so instead of having to make a whole new construct, they could use what they have and then build out from there. And so, that gave us some comfort in that space that there was well thought through ways in which the sector was actually looking at it. But we also, when we talked to the regulators, they were still in the beginning phases of thinking this too. And so that led us to a pretty positive conclusion that this could be a space where the industry and the regulators work together, right? So many times you see them butting heads and saying, no, no, no. But, this could be a new conduit they could have of a conversation to be able to say, here's what we're doing. Tell us if this looks right, right? This is how we're going to tackle that. And that kind of better understanding, I think, got us to a better environment so that in the event anything were to happen, everyone already knows what's going on. They understand the safeguards and they can work together to make intelligent and helpful regulation as opposed to reactive regulation, which may or may not address the challenge. So that was some of the key findings we had from the report, and this really led us to be in a really comfortable space as we talked about AI, both within government and outside. And it helped us get to a better spot of thinking about how we're looking at AI across the organization, because we already had some good findings and really were able to talk to some thought leaders in the sector to say, here's some positives, negatives as you deploy it across your organization.
So yeah, and so you mentioned that a lot of the institutions that you talk to have different kind of applications or understanding of AI. Maybe they're already maybe using it in terms of to address cybersecurity. I'm curious to know how would you characterize the current maturity of AI use in financial services, specifically for cybersecurity and fraud prevention,
Yeah.
um, compared to kind of what we see in the media and all the hype around it. But really, what does it look like on the ground with how AI is used to address cybersecurity and fraud prevention in the financial sector?
Yeah, so I mean, they're still looking at how to best use it, right? They're
Yeah.
using it as a way to be able to identify trends and patterns that are not easily identifiable as humans are looking through the information. That doesn't mean that they always all of a sudden see something and they say, well, that must be fraud. They then look at that as a way to be able to identify patterns of fraud that may not be as easily identified and then work to be able to research them more to see if there was actually an issue, or maybe it was just a new trend that was going on. You can imagine there's lots of new trends that occur. People spend money in different ways. People, buy stuff they may not have from vendors you never used before because some new product comes out. So you have to do more investigation in that to see whether or not that's fraud going on or something else. But it helps them out to be able to identify through the reams of data they have with their customers to be able to help their customer experience even better, right? Because instead of they're making, say, freezing your card because you're, using your card, say, in Spain, well, maybe they're able to now identify, yeah, you are going to Spain and you're doing that stuff there. And that's not unusual. It may have been an unusual trip. You never went there before, but it's not something that it immediately says it's fraudulent. So being able to identify some of these patterns is going to be helpful at the end of the day to help uh, identify where fraud is and where it isn't, and hopefully make that customer experience more seamless than it was otherwise. But it does, help in a lot of cases of identifying that fraud, right? When I was at Treasury, the Bureau of Physical Service, which is the one who pays the bills for the U.S. government to a large extent, was able to find a whole bunch of fraud using AI that they weren't able to identify otherwise. And they continue to figure out how to deploy it better to be able to identify, areas in which invoices are coming in that are incorrect, or people who aren't supposed to be getting paid are getting paid, and things like that. So there's a whole process of learning to really, at the end of the day, be able to use this as a tool, right? It is not in and of itself, and never probably will be, a result-oriented process by itself. It's a tool that humans are going to use to identify whether or not something should or should not be identified as fraud.
Right. And I guess the next important topic to discuss, especially when we're dealing with fraud, is information sharing and data sharing between financial institutions. And in your report, there, you draw a sharp contrast between relatively mature, cyber threat information sharing and the much weaker fraud data sharing. And I'm curious to know why you think fraud data is so much harder to share, and really what's at stake if it doesn't if that doesn't change, or if that doesn't mature to the same level as, say, the cyber threat information sharing.
Yeah, so for a long time, right, you talk to any network defender, any network operator, and what they want to be able to do is make sure the system doesn't go down, right? They want threat information, they want TTPs related to the threats to be able to deploy across their system and to be able to take it down. Based upon what we were hearing from industry, that was a major focus from our side to be able to figure out how to stop the nation states or the bad actors from taking down these systems. Fraud was just never brought in the same way. And I think one of the challenges was fraud was always thought of as a compliance problem, right? And a lot of people, a lot of organizations look at fraud as saying, I have to file a suspicious activity report. I got to file a CTR, right? Which just identifies something going on and not necessarily saying, yeah, this is information that's helpful and valid that can be shared otherwise. And so, you had the part of the house that was working on anti-money laundering issues and fraud. And then you had the other part of the house was doing network defense. One of the issues I try to do, and I think we're probably getting closer, is to marry those two sides closer, right? So when you're filing a SAR, you don't just file the SAR and then put it in your file cabinet and walk away. You identify what were the tactics that were used in that case, share that over with your network defenders to say, hey, if we're seeing these kind of uh, patterns being used, you should be shutting them down or thinking about shutting them down. But also taking that same information and share it with the other financial institutions and say, here's how the bad actors are doing it. Now, you can't share the names of the people, the addresses, stuff like that, right? That's protected. But at the end of the day, I don't know many fraudsters who use their real name, right? Or use names that are not going to just be thrown away for the next one. But the tactics and techniques are really interesting, right? And you're going to see, when we used to have issues with check kiting, right? There were certain ways
Yeah.
you could see a check that was being kited, right? It's usually Friday afternoon being deposited, money taken out right away. Well, okay, well, then you started to flag those. But, did you share those with other institutions? Did you share the concept of how they were doing it? So we all got smarter. After a while, that did permeate industry and people started to flag that, but it wasn't immediate. So how do we now think about using these tools and abilities to share that fraud information as soon as we can? That's just an orientation change, right? We did not think that was a key issue in the past, but what we're doing is seeing that as more and more important, that at the end of the day, that's how you're going to starve the criminal, starve the nation state actors who are trying to commit the bad acts, right? The terrorist groups and the other who are using fraud to be able to fund their activities and really kind of starve them from that activity. And but that's a shared concept that has to go forward. And so pivoting and making even sure your network defenders understand part of their job is also preventing fraud, right? It just hadn't been raised the same way. It's now getting much more and more attention.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on a point here, especially with the fraud data sharing, and it is a point you touch on in the report, the data divide, kind of the the fact that large institutions have access to all of this data compared to smaller institutions. And I do want to get your opinion on what collaborative, whether it's industry or policy approaches can be done to address this issue. Is there anything that like you said, I mean, you give examples, information can be shared, maybe anonymized. I am curious though, if some institutions have access to, because of their size, obviously have access to all of this information, what can be done to help kind of create a more democratize, I guess, the data sharing so that it's helping the industry in general.
Yeah, I guess the question is, are we talking about the data itself that's critical, or the things that were identified from the use of the data that's going to be critical?
I
And I think
the
it's the
data,
second part,
yeah,
right? So if you're
sorry.
a smaller financial institution, right, giving you all the data of the most largest financial institution in the US is never going to help you because you
Yeah,
can't process it, right?
yeah,
But how do we set up those systems and the sharing mechanisms to be able to share the outputs, right? What would we be able to
exactly.
find when we go through so much information? What were we able to identify? And we see a lot of trend reports that happen all the time. And anybody who's in the cybersecurity space know about the trend reports, the Verizon report, CloudStrike, Cloudflare, all these put out these kind of reports all the time. What are they doing? They're taking the data, they're figuring out, they're anonymizing it and finding trends and then
Right.
helping share those firms that are reading these reports to identify what they should be looking for. So the same with this, right? As these institutions look through it, how do we create an environment in which they can share the outcomes? Now, one of the key things to remember is that no financial institution is an island, right? At the end of the day, they have to work with each other. So if they're, say, going fraud through Bank A and they identify the fraud in Bank A, they want to share that with Bank B, C, D, and all the rest of them to be able to say, here's what the current trend is. Here's what we're seeing as it. By the way, why don't you look for it too? Right? Because it's not just necessarily pass the buck and hope everybody else gets hit. It's how they kind of starve the bad actors at the end of the day because they know they're going to keep coming back. And the funding itself is what benefits them. So how do they kind of change that concept? And so there are a lot of information sharing organizations out there in the financial sector. One of the key ones is the FSI, but there's many other across in which these environments happen on the local level, national level, across the board. And how do we help encourage those environments to make those kind of conversations happen? I think that's a role that government needs to be able to work on is to make sure at the end of the day that the information is they're not going to be punished because a bad actor attacked you, right? Or is doing that, but you're going to be sharing that place. And that's also tied to the regulators, right? How do they create a function and create an environment in which banks are feel free, and other financial institutions, not just banks, feel free to tell the regulator, hey, by the way, this is what we're seeing as trends. Can you share that across the board? And we've done that many times in the past when incidents were happening to make that environment better. So how do we kind of work through that? I think that's
Yeah.
but I think here the key is that the institutions have a big interest in this, right? Because every time you stop fraud, and I was a collections person way back when I started my career, every time I stopped fraud, that meant it was better for the bottom line of the organization and it was better service to the customer, right? Because the customer doesn't want to spend 4 or 5 days on the phone trying to clear up some kind of fraud in their account, right? They're like, why didn't you pick this up? So if that could be minimized, their time is freed up. They trust the institution better and they're going to be able to move forward even if they never see it, right? They're going to feel comfortable that they don't have the bad story to tell, and hopefully, right, this it helps out us all, and not only helps out the institution, but helps out the sector as a whole because these things get driven down, right, and that would hopefully
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
helpful to everyone.
Yeah, and just to on that point, like in an ideal world, and the way I would kind of imagine it is a shared data lake or database of all of this information. Maybe this would be something that's, regulated or run by the government or someone that is overseeing this system where all of these AI or models are able to query that and actually see in real time any reports or anything that needs to be flagged. Whereas it's, but it's not necessarily managed by a specific institution or a specific entity. So that's kind of how I was, but thank you for that explanation. I mean, that's definitely
Yeah.
like you said, it's something that it would be in real time, allow any institution to use their models, plug into the system where they would be able to get all this information, right away.
Yeah, the only challenge with the concept of a data lake means that that information is not the institution anymore. And
Okay,
that
yeah.
that means that the information you trusted to your institution, you don't know where it's at.
Right,
And
right,
that becomes a big issue that would need to be resolved, right? Because
right,
I trust my institution. I don't know if I trust other institutions with my information. I just don't know, right? And how
right.
does that work? So there could be two models. You could create a data lake, right? And it all gets thrown in and people play through it, or that the tool is provided to each institution and they can run through it, right? And
Yeah,
that's the way it's done a lot of times right now with shared services models and the like for being able to protect your network, right? You get a tool from a vendor and then it goes on there instead of all your information going into the data lake to protect your system. But I mean, there's many different models that need to be thought through to figure out what's the best way to get it. But at the end result, right, information sharing and fraud information sharing is really beneficial because it should be able to reduce what the current known fraud is and identifying future trends that may not be easily picked up by a single institution.
right, right. And speaking of trust, and I mean, in the report, you do mention that a lot of financial institutions are, have their own kind of in-house teams that are working on all the AI projects and tools that they need, but there's still a lot of use of vendors, third party and even fourth party suppliers, right? And where there is, those vendors and fourth party pose a risk that clearly gets more complex with AI. So if you were advising a bank's board, what would be the top three AI specific questions they should be asking their major providers right now, in this field?
Yeah, and I think this is what, as I was mentioning, one of the reports are there are no new risks, right? The risk you
Yeah,
identified in what you're just saying is the same supply chain vendor risk that exists, right? It's just a different manifestation of it. But you need to be able to ask the same questions. You need to be able to make sure that you have a process to check all your vendors, that you understand what they're turning on and what they're not turning on, what access to the information do they have outside of your environment. Can they remote into your system? Can they change information? Is it something in which they can actually offer the protection that you would want, that you tell your customers you have at the end of the day, or are they just some organization that may not be as robust in their vendor management systems internally? And of course, the challenge you have is the third and fourth party vendors too, right? In which you can work really closely with your vendor, but then they may subcontract out to somebody else.
yeah,
So how do you make sure you know that? Now, I mean, there's stuff like Graham Leach Bliley that's been out there for what, almost 30 years now or so, that talks about thinking about data information, data integrity, where it's at. Is the board, when they're bringing in this or any other new product, are they comfortable with the risk that they're assuming? Do they understand the vendor? Is the vendor aligned with the things that they want to do, or are they just on their own? Right. And that becomes very difficult if you haven't gone into it with open eyes. And the biggest challenge you have now, and I think we continue to see this, is that uh, people don't want to think they're falling behind everybody else, right? And everybody believes everybody else is, in the forefront of everything. But what we've seen across the board is it's still in its nascent stage, right? So a firm A may have a using AI in one space, firm B may be using it in a different space, and firm C is using it in a totally different space. But you as bank, firm D is like, oh my goodness, everybody else is so much more advanced.
right.
You don't have to play the catch-up game. What you got to do is figure out what's your process, what processes are you trying to make better by use of AI, have a clear plan, and move forward. And I always think back to the NIST cybersecurity document that they put out many years ago, right? And it's the number one thing is identify is first, right? Before you do anything else, identify where it is, what you're doing with it. And if you can answer that question and explain to your board why you need this, right, then you'll be in a good place. But that's what you do with every software, right? Every justification you have to say, this is why I'm doing it. And you just can't say, well, because everybody else is, because that always gets us all in trouble from everybody who's ever been teased when they were in grade school and had to do something because everybody else was doing it, right?
Yeah,
So you got to kind of think through, what does this solve? And is this really the best solution? Because sometimes AI is not the best solution, right? It may be the thing that everybody's talking about, but you may already have processes that address the issue in a more robust way. But you have to make that decision yourself and work through that. So